January 1945. The Western Front. The cold bit through canvas and wool. In a makeshift field hospital 10 miles behind what had been the Siegfried Line, a German nurse named Ilse Hofmann lay on a cot that smelled of disinfectant and dampness. Her hands, cracked from months of carbolic soap and frozen water, rested across her chest. She had not removed her boots in 4 days. Through the tent fabric, she could hear the low murmur of voices, American voices, and the steady crunch of boots on frozen mud. Someone was walking a perimeter. Someone was standing guard. She did not sleep, not at first, because in her mind, shaped by 2 years of Goebbels' broadcasts and 6 years of war, she knew what happened to women when armies changed hands. She had seen it in the faces of refugees, fleeing east ahead of the Red Army. She had heard the stories whispered in the corridors of bombed-out hospitals, in Aachen and Düren. When the Americans broke through in December, her medical unit had been cut off, surrounded, and captured within 72 hours. The doctor she worked under had burned his party membership card in a steel drum. The orderlies had buried their uniforms, and Ilse, 23 years old, daughter of a Lutheran pastor from Wuppertal, had prepared herself for the worst. But the worst did not come. Instead, an American lieutenant with a tired face and a Cincinnati accent had told her, through a translator, that she and the other nurses would be kept separate from the male prisoners, that they would continue to work under supervision, and that, his exact words, according to the interpreter, nobody lays a hand on the medical staff. Then he had posted sentries, 2 of them, farm boys from Iowa and Michigan, helmets low over their eyes, rifles slung, circling the tent through the night, while she and 11 other German nurses tried to reconcile what they had been told about Americans with what they were now experiencing. This dissonance between the propaganda and the reality was not unique to Ilse Hofmann. It was repeated in 1,000 field hospitals, prison camps, and occupied towns across Europe in the final months of the war, and it became one of the most unexamined psychological fractures of the German collapse. The moment when ideology met contradictory evidence and the ground shifted beneath certainty. To understand what those nurses felt lying awake in January 1945, one must first understand what they had been taught to expect. German wartime propaganda, particularly from 1943 onward, had painted the Western Allies, and especially the Americans, in lurid apocalyptic terms. They were depicted as a mongrel race, a nation of gangsters and plutocrats, culturally barren and morally corrupt. Jewish influence, the narrative went, had poisoned their institutions. Their soldiers were cowards who relied on material superiority, lacking the discipline and spirit of the German Lancer, and their treatment of captives, especially women, would be barbaric. Rape, theft, murder. These were the inevitable consequences of defeat, according to the Reich Ministry of Propaganda. In the waning days of the war, when the fronts closed in from east and west, German civilians and soldiers alike had been told, better to die fighting than to fall into enemy hands. For the nurses, this fear was compounded by their profession. They had spent years in field hospitals and evacuation centers, surrounded by wounded men, operating in conditions that dissolved the boundaries between caregiver and victim. They had seen what war did to bodies. They had held soldiers as they died, written letters to mothers they would never meet, and worked until their hands bled and their minds went numb. They had internalized the Nazi ideal of the self-sacrificing German woman, the caregiver who endured silently in service to the folk. But they had also internalized the warnings, the broadcasts, the pamphlets, the stories from the East, where the Red Army had carved through East Prussia and Silesia, leaving trails of testimonies that German propaganda eagerly amplified. So when the Americans came, the nurses expected violence. They expected humiliation. They expected the collapse of the last thin partition between military professionalism and the chaos of conquest. What they did not expect was sentries walking a perimeter to protect them. They did not expect soldiers who turned their backs and walked away when a woman was changing bandages. They did not expect officers who requisitioned extra blankets, who arranged for separate latrines, who treated the medical staff not as spoils of war, but as professionals continuing a necessary job under new management. Ilse Hofmann later wrote, decades later, in a letter to a West German historian, that the first night under American Guard was the longest of her life, not because of what happened, but because of what did not happen. I lay there waiting for the door to open, she recalled. I waited for boots on the floorboards, for hands on my shoulders. I had been told what would come, but it never came. And in the morning, I realized I had slept. Not much, but I had slept. And the sentry was still there drinking coffee from a canteen, looking bored. That boredom, she realized, was its own kind of message. The treatment of captured medical personnel was not accidental. It was embedded in the institutional culture of the U.S. military, itself a product of democratic norms that the Third Reich had spent a decade vilifying. The American Articles of War, derived from international conventions and domestic legal traditions, made clear distinctions between combatants and non-combatants, between prisoners of war and civilian detainees. Medical staff, even those in uniform, occupied a protected category under the Geneva Conventions of 1929. And while battlefield realities were often messier than legal frameworks, the U.S. Army, particularly its officer corps, had been trained to uphold these distinctions. Courts-martial for sexual violence, theft, and abuse of prisoners were not common, but they were real. Soldiers knew that their conduct was being monitored, that violations could end in Leavenworth, that the chain of command took these rules seriously. But there was something deeper at work than mere legalism. The American soldier in 1945 was a citizen in uniform, not a subject of the state. He came from a society where authority was conditional, where institutions were scrutinized, where the press reported misconduct and voters held leaders accountable. He had been raised in a culture that, for all its contradictions and failures, valorized fairness, decency, and restraint as civic virtues. The propaganda he had consumed did not glorify cruelty. It celebrated liberation. When he was told he was fighting for freedom, he understood that freedom had content. It meant the opposite of the totalitarian systems he was fighting against. And so when he stood guard over a tent full of German nurses, he was performing an act that was simultaneously strategic, legal, and moral. He was demonstrating, whether he articulated it or not, that the democratic world did not require the dehumanization of the enemy to win. This was the abundance that stunned the German nurses. Not material abundance, though that would come later, but moral abundance, the surplus of restraint, the luxury of mercy. Ilse Hofmann was not the only one to record this dissonance. In Allied archives, scattered among after-action reports and prisoner interrogation transcripts, are dozens of similar accounts from German medical personnel captured in the final months of the war. A nurse named Greta Scholl, captured near Remagen in March 1945, told U.S. interrogators that she had expected to be used and discarded. Instead, she found herself working in a prisoner of war hospital under American supervision, receiving the same rations as American medical staff, sleeping in a barracks guarded by military police who never entered without knocking. "It was incomprehensible," she said in a statement dated April 1945. "We had been taught that the Americans were savages, but they treated us like professionals, like equals almost." Another nurse, Margaret Linden, captured in the Ruhr pocket in April, described the cognitive shock in starker terms. "I had been ready to die," she wrote in a post-war memoir. "I had been told that capture meant dishonor worse than death. But when the Americans arrived, they were polite. They called me ma'am. They asked if I needed medical supplies. One of them, a medic from New York, showed me a photograph of his wife, who was a nurse. He said we did the same job. I did not know what to say." What these women were experiencing was the collapse of a narrative structure. For years they had inhabited a worldview in which the enemy was fundamentally other, morally inferior, racially degenerate, existentially opposed to everything German and civilized. The war in this framework was not merely a political conflict, but a cosmic struggle between incompatible forms of life. Surrender was not a tactical decision, but a metaphysical catastrophe. And yet here they were, surrendered, alive, treated not as objects to be consumed but as human beings with rights and dignity. The dissonance was unbearable, and in that unbearable space, something shifted. The symbolic object that recurs in these accounts is not a weapon or a flag, but food. Specifically, American rations. The nurses speak of it obsessively. The white bread, the canned meat, the coffee, the chocolate, not because they were starving, though many were malnourished, but because the abundance was impossible to reconcile with the image of a nation supposedly on the brink of collapse. By early 1945, German logistics had disintegrated. Frontline units were receiving irregular supplies. Hospitals operated without anesthesia. Civilian rations in the western cities had been cut to near-starvation levels. The nurses had spent months improvising, boiling bandages for reuse, diluting morphine, substituting potato alcohol for antiseptics. They had learned to live in scarcity, to make do with less, to accept that deprivation was the price of total war. And then the Americans arrived. And with them came an avalanche of material goods that seemed to defy the logic of warfare. Ilse Hofmann wrote that the first time an American soldier gave her a chocolate bar, she refused it. She thought it was a trick or a bribe or some kind of test. But the soldier, she remembered his name was Patterson from Pennsylvania, just shrugged and left it on the supply crate. It sat there for 2 days, she wrote. I looked at it every time I walked past. I thought, if I take it, I am accepting something. I am admitting something. But finally I took it, and it was real. And I ate it in 3 bites, and I cried. The chocolate was not just food. It was evidence. Evidence that the stories she had been told about American weakness, about the decadence of the democracies, were not merely wrong but inverted. The Americans were not starving. They were not desperate. They had so much that they could afford to give it away to their enemies. And if they had lied about that, what else had they lied about? Other nurses reported similar moments of rupture. Greta Scholl remembered being served coffee. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute she had been drinking for 2 years, by an American corporal who asked if she wanted milk and sugar. I thought he was mocking me, she said. But he was serious. There was milk. There was sugar. I drank it and I thought, this is what they have been fighting with. This is the army that we were told was on the verge of collapse. Margaret Linden wrote about a day in late April when an American supply truck arrived at the POW hospital where she was working. The driver, a black soldier from Georgia, unloaded crates of bandages, sulfa drugs, plasma, and surgical gloves, materials that German hospitals had not seen in months. He stacked them in the corner and said, "Y'all need anything else? Just holler," she recalled. I stared at those crates for an hour. I thought about the boys I had watched die for lack of plasma, for lack of clean bandages, and I thought about the speeches I had heard, about German superiority, about the subhuman nature of the Americans, and I understood that we had lost, not because we lacked courage, but because we had been lied to about everything. The transformation was not immediate, and it was not universal. Some nurses clung to the ideology, reinterpreting their experiences through the lens of propaganda. The Americans were trying to soften them up, to corrupt them, to make them complicit in Germany's defeat. The kindness was strategic, not genuine. The guards were watching them, not protecting them. But these rationalizations became harder to sustain as the days turned into weeks, and the evidence accumulated. The Americans did not change. They remained professional, distant, occasionally friendly, and consistently predictable. They followed rules. They respected boundaries. They treated the nurses not as enemies but as neutral parties caught in the machinery of war. For women like Ilse Hofmann, the transformation was internal and irreversible. She had been raised in a society that valorized obedience, hierarchy, and sacrifice for the collective. She had been taught that strength came from unity under a single will, that democracy was weakness, that the individual was subordinate to the Volk. But the Americans who guarded her tent, who brought her supplies, who treated her with impersonal decency, came from a society built on the opposite principles. And they had won, not through cruelty or terror, but through the application of overwhelming resources organized by a system that, for all its flaws, trusted its citizens, protected its enemies, and operated according to rules that transcended the immediate demands of power. In the years after the war, Ilse Hofmann became a nurse in the British occupation zone, then in West Germany. She never joined a political party. She never spoke publicly about her wartime experiences until the 1970s, when a researcher tracked her down for an oral history project. But in that interview, recorded on tape in a small apartment in Hamburg, she said something that captured the essence of what she had felt in that tent in January 1945. "I had been taught that the world was a struggle," she said, "that there were victors and victims and nothing in between. But those American boys standing guard, they were not victors. They were tired. They wanted to go home. They did not hate us. They did not gloat. They just did their job. And their job included protecting us. I did not understand it then. I am not sure I understand it now. But it changed me. It made me question everything I had believed about power, about nations, about what it means to be human." The broader significance of these encounters lies not in their drama. There were no battles, no heroic rescues, no cinematic climaxes, but in their quiet subversion of the totalitarian worldview. Nazism had constructed a universe in which the enemy was irredeemably evil, in which compromise was betrayal, in which the only honorable outcomes were total victory or total annihilation. The nurses, like millions of Germans, had internalized this binary. But when they encountered Americans who did not fit the script, who were neither saints nor demons, but ordinary men acting within a legal and moral framework that acknowledged the humanity of the enemy, they were forced to confront the possibility that the binary was false, that there was a third option, a world in which conflicts could be won without annihilating the loser, in which power could be exercised without cruelty, in which mercy was not weakness but policy. This realization did not make the nurses into Democrats overnight. Many remained conservative, nationalist, skeptical of the Allied occupation. But it planted a seed of doubt. And in the post-war years, as West Germany rebuilt itself under American tutelage, as the Marshall Plan poured resources into the shattered economy, as democratic institutions took root in a society that had known only authoritarianism, that seed grew. The nurses who had lain awake in guarded tents, waiting for violence that never came, became part of a generation that learned to live in a system built on consent rather than command. They raised children who took democracy for granted. They became citizens of a republic that, for all its imperfections, did not require enemies to validate its existence. The symbolic legacy of those American sentries, walking their perimeters through the frozen nights of early 1945, is thus not a legacy of conquest but of restraint. They did not liberate Germany in the sense of breaking chains or toppling walls. They liberated it in the quieter, more difficult sense of demonstrating an alternative. They showed that power did not have to devour, that victory did not have to humiliate, that the world did not have to be a death struggle between incompatible absolutes. They stood guard while the enemy slept, and in doing so, they offered a glimpse of what a post-totalitarian order might look like. There is a photograph, preserved in the National Archives, taken in March 1945 at a prisoner of war processing center near Koblenz. It shows a group of German medical personnel, nurses, orderlies, a few doctors, seated on wooden benches waiting to be interviewed. In the foreground, slightly out of focus, is an American soldier, rifle on his shoulder, looking away from the camera. He is young, maybe 20, his face tired and expressionless. Behind him, one of the nurses, her face is clearer, is staring at the ground, hands folded in her lap. She looks exhausted, bewildered, and something else, thoughtful. The photograph was labeled, in fading ink, "Enemy Medical Staff, Processed Without Incident." It was filed among thousands of similar images and forgotten. But in that nurse's expression, in the soldier's indifferent posture, in the mundane bureaucracy of the scene, there is something worth remembering. Because history is not only made in the grand gestures, the speeches, the battles. It is also made in the small, repeated acts of decency that accumulate over time and shape. The texture of the world, the German nurses who were stunned to find American soldiers standing guard while they slept were witnessing the end of one world and the beginning of another. They did not know it yet. They were too tired, too confused, too overwhelmed by the collapse of everything they had known. But in the space between the propaganda they had believed and the reality they now inhabited, something new became possible. Not utopia, not perfection, but a world in which the enemy could become, eventually, a neighbor, a partner, a friend. That transformation, from guarded sleep to cautious trust to rebuilt societies, is the unspoken triumph of the democratic order in Europe. It did not happen through sermons or manifestos. It happened through a million small interactions, a million moments when power chose restraint, when victors chose mercy, when soldiers chose to stand guard rather than take advantage. The nurses remembered those moments for the rest of their lives, and in remembering, they carried forward a truth that no amount of propaganda could erase, that the measure of a civilization is not in its capacity for violence, but in its capacity for restraint. The war ended. The tents came down. The soldiers went home. But the memory remained, a memory of cold nights, of sentries walking perimeters, of the moral abundance that stunned a generation into rethinking everything they had been taught about power, about enemies, about the possibilities of the human world. And in that memory, preserved in letters and interviews and fading photographs, is a lesson that transcends the specific history of 1945. That the choice to protect, even when no one is watching, even when the enemy is defeated and vulnerable, is the choice that defines us. Not the battles we win, not the speeches we give, but the moments when we stand guard through the long cold night and let the exhausted sleep.